So my name is Alan Story. I live in Sheffield. You can tell from my accent I wasn't born in Sheffield. I'm a Canadian, just like Dennis. And Canadians show you Brits how to win the battle for PR. No. Anyways, yeah. So I'm the co-founder with my mate Nicole Haydock of GetPRDone. What this is really good for is that, in fact, we've now got 4 groups putting on this session tonight. One is Unlock Democracy, one is Compass, one is Make Votes Matter, and the 4th one is Get PR Done. And that's the spirit of PR, to people working together who want to get the same objective. And all these 4 groups definitely want to get PR. So here's the format it's going to be. I'll give a little introduction to Dennis. Then Zach Polanski, who's the deputy leader of the Green Party, will respond and in succinct phrases explain the applicability of Dennis's ideas to the UK. So Zach, that's your assignment. Then we will have a little introduction of the groups, and then we'll go into the Q&A. And the Q&A will be based on questions that you put in the chat line. So without any further introduction, let's go for this. It's session's being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, then turn off your camera and don't put the chat line, do anything. It'll be all okay. All right, so we're really pleased that our first speaker is Professor Dr. Dennis Pilon. He's a professor of political science and chair of the political science department at York University in Toronto, Canada, where I went to school as well. And he's widely acknowledged as an expert in the field of electoral reform. Now, I won't go on and on about how many books he's written, all this kind of stuff. It's really for this audience not that important. I'll tell you, though, 2 things. One, that what Dennis does is link the question of electoral reform to wider questions of democracy. It's not like this sort of technical issue about what this. These are questions that have an awful lot to do with the way the whole country works. And I was just reading today an article that Dennis wrote in 2018, where he said the most basic issue with Western electoral democracies is they are not and never have been terribly democratic. Oh, Jesus. Well, who is this guy? He's talking that we don't live in the most democratic country in the whole world. So he's a political theorist and links PR and electoral reform to wider questions of citizen engagement, people having control of their lives, etc. That is not the general way that electoral reform is looked at. And second of all, and I speak here as a former academic myself, Dennis has a lot of credibility in the field of, he's been studying it since 18 or something, but he knows the field cold, but he's also a partisan. He doesn't pretend to be objective on the one hand and the other. And that's really positive, that an academic is speaking truth to power, giving his views. He doesn't sort of, on the one hand, he's not pretending to be objective. He's a big believer in PR, and he wants to convince you, not with sort of slogans, but actual kind of facts, arguments, and things like that. And so without any further ado, Dennis is on the screen. He's going to have a PowerPoint presentation. So Dennis, over to you.
Look, just before I launch in, I'm going to set my timer just so that I keep myself to about 25 minutes, because we want to have lots of time for your questions. Over the years, I've done literally hundreds of these meetings, and the best part of the meetings really are the questions that come from you. And so I really love it when an audience drives the content of a presentation and lets me know what you're interested in, what you want to talk about. I just want to touch quickly on what Alan ended with this idea of objectivity. And, we get a lot of academics who sort of say, well, there are pros and cons. I don't think that's really true. We don't play that game when we talk about democracy, right? You don't stand and say, well, there are pros and cons. Fascism, it had some good points. No, we don't play that game. And lots of academics will step up and say that a certain process is a good one by studying it. They'll say, look, this is a better public policy. And so that's all I'm doing here, right? I'm saying that based on democratic values, PR systems deliver the goods. And the other systems do not. And I think I can defend that by the evidence that I can bring to bear. But today's focus is on a very specific question. It's not about the performance necessarily of the other systems. It's much more about how do you get from there? How do you get from here to there? How do you get a PR system? And the title of my presentation is slightly different than what was advertised, and it's an important difference. How did other countries get PR as opposed to how did other democracies get PR? And as you'll see in my talk, a lot of countries get PR in the transition from not being democracy to being at least minimally democratic. And so I hope that'll be more clear as we go along. Let's start with what we've been told about where voting systems come from. How do we get voting systems? How do countries end up with the voting systems they do? And lots of ideas are out there. You'll hear different, media commentators and even sometimes academics or politicians, make a number of assumptions about where they come from. And then, of course, what do we know from research about the origins of these institutions? Well, we've been told lots of things. Some people will comment and say that voting systems are produced by different cultures. Different cultures have propensities towards different voting systems, adversarial cultures like first past the post, consensual cultures like PR, we're told. Others turn to functional explanations. They say, well, voting systems fit what is needed. And so a country with few divisions maybe has first past the post. A country with many divisions functionally needs a system that can do better. And so some people talk about the functions as driving the origins of the systems. Often it's assumed that some sort of consensual process has determined this, particularly in countries that are called democracies. Somehow, we don't have any details, but somehow in the past, everybody got around a table and said, let's have this system. A choice is often imputed to voting systems, that somehow they've been chosen by the countries or by the people that use them. And then, of course, conflict. There is an assumption in a great deal of the work that these things have actually been fought over, and there have been winners and losers in the process. When we turn to what we know from research, none of the previous claims are really backed up by research. Even the conflict one can in fact be supported by research, but it's not typically in the formulation that we hear. And the problem there is that none of the previous claims really address the how question. How exactly did it occur? That's what will give us the information that we need about those origins. So we need to address the who and the when questions of when different institutions come into being, when they start to be used, to really understand the how of voting system change. And that's our topic tonight. Our topic is, how do countries get different voting systems? Oh, now I seem to be stuck. There we go. Now, this is the focus of my book, Wrestling with Democracy. I'm not trying to pitch the book. You can read most of it for free on my academia edu site. So I'm not making any money here. I'm just saying that if you're really interested in the details of how Western industrialized countries got the voting systems they did, I go into a lot of detail in this book. In fact, I cover 18 countries over 150 years. I look at every instance of national voting system reform across the Western European and Anglo-American sphere, including, of course, the United Kingdom. And so, there's a law. I know a little bit about this particular question of how countries move from one system to another. So how do voting systems get adopted? Well, the short answer is multi-party cooperation and collaboration. The long answer is multi-party cooperation and collaboration informed by unique historical contexts. So there's no key. I can't hand you the golden ticket that will take you to PR every time. Instead, what we have are some generalizations drawn from historical experience where we can see some similar things going on. It doesn't mean that the challenge we have in the present will be exactly the same. We always have to try to take those lessons and then adapt them. As I say here in the challenges for now, we have to identify the present unique historical conditions that may create a multi-party buy-in. I say that all of the examples we can see in the past involved multi-party cooperation. So in terms of looking at it for the present, we've got to figure out, well, what is going on in this particular historical juncture that would create multi-party buy-in for change? So if we look at the historical party cooperation historically, I would divide it up into three broad periods. We've got the early 20th century, we've got the mid 20th century, and then we've got the late 20th century. And in many ways, some of the stuff that we've seen in the early 21st century is sort of lumped in with the late 20th century. So there's some similarities there, particularly the last category involving Western Europe and beyond. And so this breakdown helps us to focus our attention. The conditions aren't exactly the same in the three different periods, though there are some broadly similar circumstances in all three, which I hope to highlight, and hopefully you'll tease out with your questions. Now, I got a big table here, and you don't have to memorize this. There's not going to be a quiz later on, but this is mostly just here, so that you know that we got a list. And if you want to go and look at that list in detail, you can find it on the Fair Vote Canada website. Just Google Fair Vote Canada, and you will find this chart on multi-party collaboration on voting system reform. But you really do see some interesting trends here. And so this early period, which is tracking from 1899 to roughly 1927, you can see, and again, I'm just looking at Western industrialized countries who share similar processes of democratization. And so you can see here, look at the last category, multi-party agreement, multi-party agreement, multi-party agreement. In fact, the only distinction is when it's not about proportional representation. So the cases where we see the adoption of, for instance, majoritarian systems or plurality systems, it's single-party imposition. But where we see a move to proportional, it's almost always some sort of multi-party agreement that's going on. And, I can go into the details of these different countries and the things that conditioned their decisions. There's some really interesting nuances, for instance, between Belgium, early adopter, to Switzerland, did use a referendum. They're unusual in their adoption, to Ireland in 1922, all different stories, but again, with some very similar tendencies at work. Now, this mid-20th century period is looking at sort of just before World War II, and then the other cases almost all following World War II. And so you can see the post-war restoration of democracy in countries that lost their minimal democracies in the interwar period all return to PR through some sort of multi-party agreement, though not all of them remain that way. And then my most recent categories, the most late 20th century, I divided up into three different areas of interest. We've got the Southern European restorations of democracy in the 1970s. Then we've got the post-communist restorations of democracy in the 1990s. I'm just looking here at Central Europe. Obviously, a larger category would include the former Yugoslavia, other areas farther east. And then more recently in Western Europe, where we've seen countries like France, New Zealand, Italy, and Japan. Here, of course, I'm just looking at the national level. Obviously, if I was including subnational reform, then I would also include the United Kingdom, which has had a considerable amount of experience with voting system reform at the subnational level. So what are the themes from history that we can draw out? And I'm just giving you an incredible blast of history, right? A century of reform to try to give you a taste of the processes. Well, what we can discover in looking at these different periods is that battles over voting rules are almost always battles over democracy or the scope of democracy. The early period, the period where we were looking at sort of 1899 to 1927, I mean, people forget that the minimal conditions of democracy are actually a fairly recent thing in historical time. Most countries did not meet those conditions until after World War I. And so those minimal conditions would be things like the combination of what we call in the British tradition responsible government, the Westminster system where the executive is controlled by the legislature, a fairly open franchise, maybe not entirely open, but certainly a significant mass franchise, and then fair and equitable electoral processes. So in other words, no corruption. This is something that limited, for instance, American elections well into the 20th century. It was the high degree of corruption and the all sorts of voter suppression that was going on that limited their claims to being a fully democratic experience in that country. Many people track the final piece of the minimal democratic puzzle in the UK to the 1918 Representation of the People Act, which essentially brought in a significant number of working class people into the electorate, and of course also bringing women into the electorate at the same time. But what people don't often realize is that up to half of the working men at the time couldn't vote before World War I, either because of franchise restrictions or because of voter registration restrictions, and that's in the UK. So democracy is coming much later than people realize, and it is coinciding with these cataclysmic historical events that are reshaping the relationship between the masses and the elites that have traditionally controlled the processes of representation and governance. So this early period around World War I is defined from a move to minimal democracy, from non-democracy, and it's very much influenced by the elite fear of democracy. And what is often surprising to fans of PR, who in this context see it as a very democratic move, PR was taken up by almost all of the anti-democratic forces around World War I. They saw it as a way of limiting this democratic majority that was forcing itself onto the political system. And so PR was kind of their fail-safe, right? A way of limiting that impact. What's ironic is that even though it was introduced for less than democratic reasons, the results ended up being much more democratic than anyone had predicted they would. So in that sense, it sort of demonstrates sometimes that the purposes or the things that people think they will accomplish with reforms don't always necessarily play out. In the case of democratization, that was a good thing. Later on, we do see genuinely democratic forces battling for PR or battling against PR, but of course that's in a different context. The mid-20th century period is mostly about the restoration of those pre-war voting systems. So we see most of these countries that are adopting PR were also countries that used PR in the interwar period. And the adoption of PR is conditioned by this emerging Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And that is influencing decisions about the voting systems that should be used. In some cases for democratic reasons, for some cases, not so much. Now, in the late 20th century, we see two interesting trends emerge as voting systems, which had long laid sort of dormant, come back into the mainstream of democratic and political discussion. So on the one hand, we see countries that are returning to a minimal democracy where no player has any advantage, all adopting PR. So those, Greece, Spain, Portugal, no question, they're going for PR because nobody has an advantage in the system. And so it's in no one's interest to adopt first past the post. The return of democracy to the Eastern Bloc, nobody, not one single country adopts first past the post from the group of countries. And again, precisely because nobody wants to take the risk that they're going to end up the big loser. First past the post is almost never adopted by a new country or people who are in a position to make a decision without any other influence or coercion. PR, or first past the post, is almost always a pre-democratic or pre-democratic holdover from the pre-democratic period. It's held in place by political forces who are conceding some opening, but don't have to necessarily open things up entirely. And so they're able to maintain first past the post, which of course, not surprisingly, also maintains their position of dominance in the system. Where we have seen something new in the last 25, 30 years is the focus on voting system reform as a reaction to a breakdown in the traditional party systems. And that has been a key factor in raising the question in the United Kingdom. It's been a key factor in Canada. It's been a key factor in New Zealand. And so lots of reasons we can go into more detail about that, but that is certainly important. So what are some of the patterns from history that we can draw out? Well, one is that the introduction of a proportional voting system requires multi-party cooperation and collaboration. That is fairly well established in terms of where we see this move forward. The introduction of non-PR systems nearly always result from single-party imposition. And so that's also interesting. The early period sees the right and center call for PR to stall the left. Remember, you got to put yourself in the position. It's World War I. Things are going in a weird way as far as the traditional elites are concerned. You've got a revolution in Russia that's claiming it's going to put the workers in power. You've got left-wing parties demanding that the working class can enter the political system and influence things. And many people think that this group is going to be the majority of voters, and they are going to march to power and basically act the same way that the elites that have previously controlled things had, in their self-interest. Things didn't work out that way, but that's what elites thought. And so they acted on what they thought, and they moved to PR as a way of limiting the power of this new voting majority that was coming, into the political system. Now, what's interesting is that the left at the time also supported PR as a matter of principle. It had long been debated amongst various, left-wing parties and movements, and they had it, and they had pushed PR as natural justice. It just made sense that everyone should be represented fairly. You often, when you read the academic literature, and I'm amazed sometimes how naive my colleagues are, they sort of look at it and say, well, everybody agreed. There was no debate. There was no discord, when in fact there was a lot of discord at the time. But sometimes, people who want different things can agree on something, and they think different results may emerge from it. In the mid-20th century, we see the right, the center, and the left all calling for PR amid the post-war uncertainty. So again, we have a situation where the political right, particularly on the continent, has been discredited by its collaboration with fascist powers. And a lot of right-wing supporters are worried about what's going to happen in the post-war period because clearly they're in some trouble given what's happened during the wartime. But at the same time, the left remains, for the most part, a champion of PR. Part of that is that the left has learned that they don't necessarily command a majority of the voters. And so they too are concerned about what might happen with the introduction of a first-past-the-post voting system. Now, there were some exceptions, and so West Germany developed a very unique mixed-member proportional system. Initially, it had support from all parties, but it was interesting as the Cold War started, the political right started to detach itself from that consensus. Early on, the American occupying powers insist on PR, in part because they want PR in the eastern part, the Soviet zones. But as the Cold War breaks out, then they shift decisively in favor of first past the post, and the political right in Germany follows them. But at that point, it's too late. The MMP system is already in place and can't really be taken out. We see in the late 70s and into the 90s, democratic restorations have similar dynamics. Nobody is prepared to adopt first past the post for fear that they'll end up on the wrong end of that representation. In the late 20th century, we see the left and right split on PR, depending on the economic context in any given country. So in some cases, we see the left and center call for PR as a strategy to limit neoliberal economics. And that was certainly the case in New Zealand. And I mean, to a limited extent, probably that's also true in the United Kingdom and in Canada, at least for some activists. For the right, they call for an end to PR to help entrench neoliberal economics. So in countries like Italy or in Japan, the shift away from their traditional voting systems was an attempt to break up the social blocks that were preventing the economic reforms that powerful actors wanted to move on. All right, let me draw my comments to a close. The perennial question of leftists, but also others, is what is to be done? You get this information, but what are you going to do in your own communities, in your own country, where you are facing a very particular and unique set of circumstances that are not exactly the same as anywhere else? Well, the introduction of proportional systems in Western countries, as I've suggested, is always the product of multi-party agreement, not referenda or any other processes. I mean, there are a few examples of referenda, like Switzerland bringing in a voting system, or New Zealand more recently. But behind the scenes was also a lot of multi-party agreement, even in those cases. Agreements are worked out in unique historical conditions that marry party self-interest with the public interest in greater democracy. And so we can see at various points that we shouldn't, just because a party may want something because it benefits them, doesn't necessarily mean it's not also in the public interest. So that's something to keep in mind. And so the challenge for now is to identify how to link the public interest in greater democracy to the existing state of your party system. Where are the openings? Where are the breaks? And they will emerge sometimes without warning. And so then you need to be prepared to step in and make the most of those openings. But here you need to remember that as we struggle for more democracy, we face organized forces in our societies who will continually battle for less. That is the battle of the 20th century. It's not a battle between different visions of democracy, which is what we're often told. It's actually a battle between democracy or not democracy. And so we have forces that have remained throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century that want to limit the public's purchase on democratic decision-making. They want to limit the extent to which government acts in the interests of the many. And instead focus on the financial interests of the few. And so not surprisingly, any campaign for greater democracy will find themselves faced with powerful actors who will attempt to introduce red herrings and, I mean, just essentially lie, to try to stop and derail that campaign. I think you saw a bit of that in your referendum campaign for the alternative vote. We certainly have seen that in the multiple campaigns for proportional representation at the subnational and national level in Canada. Look, I've covered a lot of stuff in this talk, and obviously I can't go into everything, but if you have more interest in these topics or you want to follow up on any of the concerns I'm raised, you can find all of my published work available for free on my academia.edu site. Just Google Dennis Pilon, it'll be one of the first things that come up. And if tonight you don't get a clear answer to a question that you pitch, I welcome you to email me. I'm happy to follow up with any of you with any of the concerns or interests that you might have.
Great stuff, Dennis. Thank you. I found that, whoa, wow, there's so much, we could go on to 11:30 tonight talking about all of this. But we're going to move now to Zach, who I think has got a bit of a tough job, actually. I was feeling sorry for you a bit, Zach, how you'd be able to pull this off. Zach, by the way, is the deputy leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, and he's also an elected member of the London Assembly. He also used to be a Lib Dem. I think he sort of got the pro-PR religion in the Lib Dems, and now he's in the Greens. And it's fair to say that Zach is the most high-profile sort of leading Green politician to be promoting PR. There's been some criticisms that the Green Party actually doesn't promote PR enough, because if we did have PR, the Greens would be, I think one could easily argue, the main beneficiary of PR. But that's for another moment. Zach, give us what you think Dennis's very rich talk says to us here in the UK about how, I mean, you're committed to PR. I'm sure 98% of the people here on this call are committed to PR. What do you take from what Dennis had to say as to how, I mean, we're not going to have it by Christmas or something, but what are the steps that we could be taking to move ourselves closer to PR in this country? Over to you, Zach.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thanks for inviting me to all of your organizations. And indeed, Dennis, that was a wonderful presentation. I, like you, have probably done hundreds of webinars, particularly around proportional representation, but you were making points that were fresh to my ears, or at least were presented in a different way. And I'm sure the audience will agree with that. Rather than just giving a pre-prepared speech, I do genuinely just want to respond to some of the points you've made. So I'll jump into that in a moment. The bit, I guess, that is pre-prepared, but I always want to say is this is the most important issue facing us in our time. Now, people will say, oh, that's removed from the kind of real life issues that people talk about, the National Health Service, war in Ukraine, the climate crisis, defending striking workers. But until we have a democracy, and I agree with the presupposition that we don't currently have a democracy that is working. So can it really be called a democracy in any authentic sense? Until we have a true democracy where people's views are represented and they don't have to tactically vote or feel like they're forced to choose the worst of two bad options, then we can't deal with those other issues. So don't let anyone ever tell you on this call that this is a second order issue or something that's not important, because Dennis started by saying this is often classed as a geeky issue. And I understand that framing, but actually for those of us who have knocked on doors and literally hundreds of thousands of doors, people tell you all the time, I don't trust politicians, nothing will ever change, my vote doesn't count. What they're really saying there is the political system is not working for me, we do not have a democracy, and we need to get that changed. So anyway, that's the bit that I often say, so that is pre-prepared. But moving on. So I think the really good news here is exactly what we're doing tonight, being on a Zoom call. There's 100 people on this Zoom right now, and I'm sure other people will see this recording afterwards. 10, 15 years ago, before we had Zoom, we would have had to go around the country kind of doing roadshows with these things. And I think to have 10 or 15 people in a room talking about democracy would feel really exciting. But actually, with new technology now, you can garner this number of people who can be here to have an in-depth discussion about proportional representation, a Q&A that we're about to have. And I agree with Dennis, that's the most important part. And then crucially, the actions that you can take away. And already, if you can take one action away from Dennis's talk, I'd say talk to people, particularly if you're in a political party, but even if you're not, in fact, even more if you're not in a political party, if you're in community groups or in a faith group, talk to people about the fact that if they're not interested in politics or they feel like it's not working, probably the number one barrier is the lack of a democratic voting system. And I think when we get that genuine grassroots movement that can begin online, but then has to move physically into our communities, that's how things change. Now, Dennis talked about the fact that this will take multi-party cooperation and agreement, and that's music to my ears. I don't want to talk about non-partisanship by being partisan, so I'll be partisan for 10 seconds, but recognize I'm doing it. As deputy leader of the Green Party, my party and me as a politician are truly committed to collaborative, cooperative politics. It's absolutely in the DNA of how we work. But so I'm also not being partisan. I think that is also true of the Liberal Democrats, the SNP, Plaid Cymru. I think not all the time, as it's not true of the Green Party all the time. But the best of us, when we're performing at our best, is when we're not looking for division or to divide, but actually is looking for consensus. Where can we move forward on things? Alan mentioned that I'm elected to the London Assembly. I've been there all day today, probably in a 6-7 hour meeting. But actually, the key thing about the London Assembly is we are elected by proportional representation. So even if I didn't want to, and I do want to, I am forced to work with colleagues in the Liberal Democrats, in the Labour Party, and indeed in the Conservative Party. But I think this results in better politics, because actually what happens is I come from a firm position. I hear the other side's firm position. I hear other firm positions. And just slowly you have to move and creep towards each other to a consensus position. I think we've got to get out of the mode of seeing consensus as a bad thing or in some way demonstrating that people don't have integrity. I think as long as you're clear and you're transparent about what your values are, why you've had to come to a consensus position because of working together, and demonstrate that that consensus position represents what the majority want in true democratic form, much more than a winner takes all idea where 27% of people can get exactly what they want, everyone else gets nothing that they want. And I think you could even argue that under the current system, a lot of people who voted Conservative, for instance, have not voted for this brand of conservatism, which I would argue, again, in a partisan way, I recognize that, but has been hijacked by UKIP, by the far right. And when people say, will proportional representation not result in more extremist voices, just look at who is running our government right now. It does not. Anyway, I think that point is made. Organized forces, I think this is a really good point, and something that in the PR movement, and I'm talking very widely about the democratic sector, we can be naive to. We think if we talk beautifully about democracy and kind of that true values and true ideals, and I love them. I'm a huge fan of the West Wing and any idealistic kind of TV program or world where the democratic debate wins and there's no kind of nastiness or spin. But actually, we saw it happen with the Brexit debate, and I'm Obviously, I have a position on Brexit, but I'm not forcing that position on what is essentially a cooperation of groups across the whole sector. But my point is, we saw the toxicity and division and lies that were told. We saw the media partisanship that was told. We have not seen anything yet. When it comes to the fight for proportional representation, when those forces feel like they're losing their grip on power because we have a genuine democracy, they will pull every trick in the book, from finance campaigning, from dodgy tricks with trying to silence voices, with sheer lies about democratic systems, with trying to divide people who could find consensus if they would just work together. We have to be prepared for this. And I'm really glad we're having these conversations right now, because we can't get to the point where a government says, okay, we're ready for PR, and suddenly the whole democracy movement falls into itself with infighting. We do need to speak with a united voice. That doesn't mean we lose our own personal identities. It doesn't mean that I will not proudly be deputy leader of the Green Party and Daisy Cooper will proudly be deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats, but we still maintain those identities, but go, okay, how can we work together on this? Because this is for the greater good. This is about securing democracy for every single person. We live in a country where 1 in 4 children are living in poverty. I could give lots of statistics of how poor this country is right now. I won't go off on that because it's a different subject, but in many ways it's absolutely interlinked. All the problems we're having in this country right now around social justice and around the environmental crisis do come again from a lack of democracy, where we have vested interests who are receiving campaign donations from oil and gas companies, or all sorts of people, where there's a lack of transparency and a culture of safe seats. That means even though they know we know that, and even though they know we know that, and we know that, they don't care because they can just continue to get away with it. And then the very final thing I'd say is this, before handing over to Alan and the Q&A, is I'm talking about this non-partisanship, but the elephant in the room here is the Labour Party. Now, I think we've got to have a carrot and a stick here. I've been a huge advocate of the carrot approach, to work with our Labour colleagues who do believe in proportional representation, to encourage the trade unions, not just myself, but the wider sector for sure, have moved Labour on this. It's important to note that at Labour conference, they have now voted to be in support of proportional representation, including the trade unions. But it is not enough. The carrot has not worked, and I think we need to be clear that the carrot is failing, because Keir Starmer has been so confident in his own power that he's been able to turn, ironically, to the democratic process within his own party, shrug his shoulders and say, no, I just don't want to do that. So again, it's absolutely vital that multi-party, cross-party cooperation, we point out that Labour are the obstacle and the barrier here. And actually, sometimes you hear Labour activists argue that he needs to win an election first, but we have this unique historical opportunity that Dennis was talking about. We have a deeply unpopular government, more unpopular than a government have ever been in my lifetime and possibly anyone's lifetime on this call. And we have a Labour Party who look like they're getting into government. What a powerful move it could be for Keir Starmer in this moment to recognise the democratic deficit at the heart of our country, which he has ironically already recognised when he ran for leadership, but has now completely roamed back from. And I think we absolutely need to put pressure on Keir Starmer specifically to move from this position, because ultimately to back proportional representation in a position of strength will be so much more powerful than if it's looking like he can't win and then he has to do it from a position of weakness to try and garner votes. Anyway, loads more to say, but thank you for having me on the panel and looking forward to the questions.
Right. Thank you there, Zach. Okay. William, just as a slight change, William Relton, is a slight change in the program here because 2 of the groups have pitched up. So I'm now going to unmute Sean Roberts. Sean? Sean isn't there. Okay, I'm going to now unmute. Oh, yes, he is. Hi, this is Sean Roberts from Unlock Democracy. Tell us briefly what Unlock Democracy is and ask a question, Sean.
Well, we are a small non-profit who campaign for a vibrant, inclusive democracy in the UK that puts people in charge, which hopefully is something that people can get on board with today. And that covers a wide range of democratic issues, including PR, which is obviously one of the most important ones. I think the question I'd like to ask is that in many ways now, the argument in the UK isn't about whether PR is a good thing or not. It's much more moving towards a timing issue of, well, that's not the most important thing to do right now. Or I've even heard the term, it's a second term issue from a person who actually supports PR. What can you sort of suggest to us in terms of putting forward the argument of that PR is something that can be done, that needs to be done early, quickly, when there is a change of government?
Okay, thanks, Sean. Now, I just wanted to hold off for a second, Zach and Dennis. James is here from Make Votes Matter. James, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi,
Good.
yeah. So
Hi,
I'm James Southern.
sorry, James. James, I forget your last name.
Southern.
Yeah, right. James from Make Votes Matter.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm James
Make
Southern.
Votes Matter and ask your question.
Sure. So Make Votes Matter is a single-issue, cross-party grassroots campaign for proportional representation in UK general elections. We're a growing movement of passionate citizens campaigning alongside our alliance of celebrities, political parties, community groups for a better form of politics. And this is coordinated by a core team of staff and volunteers. Our campaign involves on-the-street campaigning, organising events and mass lobbies, like the sort of system which we organise with several of the co-hosts here as well, as well as providing speakers to local community groups and trying to build consensus along pro-PR campaigners via the Good Systems Agreement, which you can find on our website. And yeah, first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for this webinar. It's really interesting to put our specific campaigning inside this historical context. So it's really great to hear that. Thanks for doing it. And my question is, basically, like, we know we need to persuade both the public and the political leaders, and the political leaders somewhat care what some of the public think. But do you have thoughts on where specifically we should be putting the most energy for our campaigns?
Okay, Dennis and Zach. Dennis.
Okay.
Both questions.
Yeah, why don't I jump in? Starting with Sean's question first. Yeah, there's lots of reasons to move quickly. There are logistic questions. To design a new voting system and have it in place for a next election actually is a really complicated thing. And so your, version of Elections Canada will need a lot of time to design that, right? Because any change in the system, unless you're going to keep all the ridings and then add a bunch of extra ones, which would be not as hard, you'll probably have to make the ridings that you have bigger if you're doing MMP or STV. So there'll be all kinds of issues around where to draw the lines, and just there's a lot of work that would need to be done, and that will take an entire term to get ready and have in place and ready for the public to use in the next election. So that is the first most immediate practical reason to move quickly. But the more political reason is that the longer you wait, the more your actions can be portrayed as self-interested. You wait until the latter half of your second term to say, hey, maybe the voting system should change. People are going to say, well, that sounds suspicious. Whatever you do, it's going to be cast in a negative light by your opponents. But absolutely, I would agree that trying to get through to Labour that this is a priority, that it's a first-term priority, an immediate priority, it can deliver all sorts of benefits, right? A new government has a honeymoon period, and to say we're going to change the voting system, the one that we just benefited from, would actually do a lot to rebuild trust in the political system, which was one of the questions that came up in the mix. Now, I forgot the second question.
Why don't you just rephrase it again, James? Sorry.
Sure, yeah, it's about where do we focus our energies, really? Is it about getting the public on board and kind of framing the national debate for, as you say, these oncoming onslaughts, or should it be about kind of persuading the political leadership?
I'm going to give you a really unsatisfying answer and say that you have no choice but to move on multiple fronts, because you never know where the weakness in the dam is going to emerge. Obviously, a public that has some sort of vague notion of what you're talking about is an incredible benefit. When I started working on this topic 35 years ago, everybody thought the PR was public relations. In Canada now, you can walk down the street and ask somebody about PR, and 3 out of 10 will tell you it's proportional representation, and another 2 will say, I think I know something about that. And that's real progress. Every single party in Canada has a position on electoral reform. Nobody cannot have one anymore. That's progress, and that has come from mobilizing people's knowledge in civil society. But don't think that you're going to train a group of everybody in society to understand all the minutiae of voting systems, because that's probably not realistic. It's very, very hard. Parties are struggling to get people out to the polls. It's very hard to mobilize people around an issue. So that's also why you have to work with opinion leaders. You've got to try to change the views of different people in the media, and you've got to continue to have people work within the different parties to look for openings and opportunities, to say, hey, our party should talk about this. Our party should offer to talk about this. Our party should have a citizens' assembly. Move them closer and closer to an actual commitment.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. Zach, do you want to jump in there? I'm just going to sort of tilt the things a little bit towards Dennis, but feel free to jump in sometimes, Zach.
Sure, I'd love to answer these ones just briefly. I think to put them kind of as one question in some ways, I would encourage anyone who's in a political party to lobby their leadership. Obviously, in the Green Party, I would say you probably don't need to do that with me. I'm very pro proportional representation. But if we're looking at a minority government, and I think that is a real possibility at the next election, and it's why, to be honest, I'm more hopeful for proportional representation than I've ever been. Not complacent, but hopeful. I think particularly looking at the Liberal Democrats, they are pro-proportional representation, to be completely fair to them. But I also think there will be a moment where they will have to stick with they'll have to make a choice between being pro-proportional representation or possibly taking ministerial seats. And I think Ed Davey needs to hear really loud and clear from as many Liberal Democrat members as possible right now that in the event of a hung parliament or any kind of coalition, that proportional representation must be a red line. Now, it's going to be too chaotic to do that work a day or two after the election. No one's going to be looking at their emails. They're going to be tired, and those negotiators are in the negotiating room, will be in the negotiating room, not looking at emails. But if the narrative is so clear that party members in all those parties want proportional representation, then it will be really clear for the leadership what exactly they need. Never underestimate the power of an email to political leadership. One or two can be dismissed, but when they come in lots, particularly if they're personal emails, then politicians do hear them. Just the second bit, is about I also want to say, what is the stick? And I think that partly is Sean's question as well, this kind of second term. Well, again, it's partisan and deputy leader of the Green Party, but I think the stick for the Labour Party is telling them you're not going to vote for them. I did an interview yesterday with Owen Jones, the journalist, which is on YouTube, and I got lots of other emails afterwards, but a lot of these emails said things like, I agreed with every word you said. I'm just really worried about letting the Tories in. Tell me why I don't need to tactical vote. Now, I'm really pleased those people are talking to me, because I think in about 30 seconds, I can have this conversation and tell them why they don't need to tactical vote. But there's lots of people I can't talk to. And so as far as Keir Starmer is concerned, this whole system is working for him, because as long as people feel like this kind of get the Tories out narrative is kind of dominating the discourse, then it's in his interests not to back proportional representation and to carry on this two-party system. So it's really important that even if you're a Labour member or a Labour voter, that you make it clear that that is not guaranteed. It's a privilege and not a right. And actually, if the Labour Party cannot back democracy and cannot back your right to a fair vote, you won't back them either. Now, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here because you're all on this Zoom call, but for those of you who have friends or family who are voting for the Labour Party, point out to them that voting for the Labour Party at this point in time is continuing the status quo of a democratic system that isn't working, and the best thing you can do is make it clear to the Labour Party that they cannot take your vote for granted.
Okay, thanks, Zach. Now, there's two other groups that were organizing this, co-hosting this event. One of them is Compass, and one of them is GetPRDone. And William Relton of GetPRDone is just going to read out briefly what those two groups' short blurb is. William. Oh, I have to
unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Hello, everybody. And thank you very much for coming. So these are the blurbs that most of you will have already read on the invite, but just so that you know who the other two groups are. Compass is the political home for everyone who wants to be part of a much more equal, democratic and sustainable future. We are powered by members working to change the political system at the next election and win as one. That's Compass's statement. And GetPRDone's statement is, GetPRDone is a cross-party, no-party campaigning group that is working to bring in a proportional representation voting system in the UK. As well as carrying out widespread social media and offline campaigning, We believe that the first step on the road to PR has to be an energetic cross-party, no-party campaign to win Labour Party support.
Thank you, William. Okay, James, are you ready with the questions?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay, so James is going to now read out the questions one at a time, or whatever rhythm you think works best, James, to Dennis and Zach to jump in as well. Okay.
Well, the first questions are kind of about the abuse potentially or overrepresentation, maybe, of political forces within PR. GT asks, why is the right salivating for to progress embracing PR? Answer, the right is well funded. The right got the UK to leave the EU on the basis of funding the manipulation of a small part of the electorate. We have to fight for reform of party funding as well as PR. Without this, the right will be winners from PR. And the other question about kind of distorting effects perhaps of PR is a question from Marisha Ray, who asks, how has PR driven forward the power of the far right in other countries? Would we do that in the UK? What forms of PR would reduce the likelihood of this?
Thanks, James. Okay, Dennis and Zach.
Well, I mean, I think the point in the first question is dead on, right? You can't look at voting systems entirely in isolation. They obviously work within a larger political ecosystem that involves funding. So yeah, funding is crucially important. I mean, in the United States, the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court basically struck down all funding restrictions, and it has been a gong show for just billionaires running everything. It's obviously terrible and unequal and undemocratic. And so campaign finance must be a crucial political objective. I'm not sure that I would go as far as to say that in the absence of it, the right will dominate PR. I think what we see in looking at 100 years of PR use on the continent is that the right has a really hard time getting a majority of the votes. They have a hard time getting a majority of the people to support them. Now, there are cases and times when we see significant groups of people move to the right. But those tendencies are exaggerated in first past the post. The thing about PR is that you are limited to what you've got coming for the most part. So 30% of the vote, 30% of the seats. That, to me, is the biggest safety against the influence of the right. But let's not kid ourselves. If enough people are moving in a certain direction, no voting system is probably going to stop those views. And they're going to work in concert with all sorts of other things. A lot of people blame the Nazi takeover in Germany on PR, but the fact is that things were going on in Germany at the civil society level that were undermining any possibility of a fair democracy, not simply the voting system. And of course, the Nazis never did actually win power electorally. They were granted power and then seized power. So I don't find the concerns about the role of the right in PR to be supported by the historical record. In fact, when we look at the rise of so-called extremist parties on the continent, what we discover is that they rise and fall throughout the 20th century, but for the most part, other parties won't work with them. And so eventually voters abandon them and go back to other parties. Now, we have seen some interesting changes over the past 10 years with various major parties playing footsie with some of the more extremist parties. But again, they find themselves much more limited in PR systems than they do in first past the post systems. In first past the post systems, when those groups manage to get control of a key party, they can really wreak havoc on a political system. So again, I go into some of these details in my published work where I take on these arguments about, is this a gift to the political right? I don't think so, and I don't think the evidence supports it.
Okay, do you want to add anything, Zach?
Yeah, just briefly, I think this comes under the category of when people say that proportional representation will not be a panacea. And I think the thing you have to do is shrug your shoulders and say, no, it won't, whatever is a panacea. But actually, I see it for another metaphor as a locked door. And until you unlock that door, you can't deal with those other things, because without proportional representation, we're unlikely to be able to reform campaign finance, likely to reform the media meaningfully, unable to abolish the unelected House of Lords. These are all things that need doing too, but it's very difficult to do these things until you've got a system of PR. And then the second thing I'd say, I won't go on too much because I think Dennis articulated it really well. But when people say, you know, they're worried about these extremist voices, well, actually, the best disinfectant is transparency. And ultimately, for those of us who consider ourselves on the left, or for those who consider themselves centre or centre left, we have to be more confident in the power of our argument. Get them in the House of Commons or in our democratic accountability spaces, and then let's win the debate by votes. If we've got to the point where we're worried that we can't win the debate, so we want to lock them out, then actually we've turned into as bad as they are, because that's not a democracy either. So we have to be more confident in the power of our arguments and allow a democratic process to overrule our own personal ideology or values, because the democratic process has to be at the heart of everything. Otherwise, you know, we're really screwed, to be honest. Like, we need to make sure that that constitution is in place. And of course, sorry, a written codified constitution is the other thing this country badly needs.
Thanks, Zach. Okay, James, the next question, please.
We have a question from Alison Early. Is there a role for citizens' assemblies raising awareness, support for participation?
You know, the thing about citizens' assemblies is that they contribute to developing legitimacy around the process. Now, I don't have a problem with parties. You know, a lot of people are, you know, got a big hate on for parties, and I don't, right? I see parties as a collective action strategy. The process is about voters. You know, we're not doing this because we love parties, and we're not doing it for parties. We're doing it for voters. Every voter has a right to have their vote registered for the choice that they want to make. It just so happens that people vote for parties. And so I take my cue from what people do. People want different parties to represent them. It's not my position to argue with that. And so that, to me, is the essential thing. I don't have a problem with parties being involved in a discussion. But the beauty of a citizens' assembly is that it allows people to feel, and in fact, substantively do, apply the democratic values that we hold to the process. And that is what the fear is. When parties run the show, there's a fear that, well, maybe they're just doing this because it serves their interest. As I said, sometimes their interest can be our interest too. But a citizens' assembly usually brings a broad group of people from the community, and I think that's the most valuable part. So to me, the citizens' assembly decision is not about PR or not PR, because frankly, I don't see many democratic arguments against PR, and I go through that in my work. But in terms of how to do PR, that's where I see a citizens' assembly being quite valuable. The citizens' assembly can be tasked with, well, what's the best system for the United Kingdom? You know, is it SDV? Is it MMP? Is it some made in the United Kingdom system? You know, you give them the values you want, proportionality of results, every vote count, and then you let them do the work. And you come out of that with a great deal of legitimacy for the process.
Can I just jump in on that? The one thing is that I'm not opposed to citizens' assemblies, but they still have a pretty low profile in this country as any kind of a body that's got, quote, legitimacy. I mean, we just, you know, they had them in Ireland, and, you know, it resulted in things about the abortion issue. But in this country, there's still pretty, you know, low profile bodies. Partially, you know, it costs money, get experts in, blah, blah, blah. Zach, for example, do you know many citizens' assemblies in this country on any issue, not just PR?
Yeah, there's been a few pretty high-profile ones around the climate crisis. I'm thinking of one in Camden Council, I believe up north as well, potentially in Sheffield. I think they were also looking at them there. But I think it's interesting what you say about them not being particularly well known. And I've got a short personal anecdote, I think, which is revealing. So when I was first elected to the London Assembly, I met London Mayor Sadiq Khan for the first time in public, and I was able to ask him about anything I wanted. And I decided to ask him about citizens' assemblies. And the way I framed it was the idea of bringing citizens' voices into City Hall, into the chamber, so they could ask their questions. And his response was really revealing. And by the way, I don't mean this as an attack on Sadiq Khan, because I think this is much more symptomatic of a problem we have in our democracy. He said to me that I'd just been elected by millions of people across London, and I shouldn't make myself in danger, or I should be careful, I shouldn't put myself in danger of being redundant. And I think that's really revealing about a top-down version of politics that says, I'm the mayor or I'm the MP. I know everything. I have all the answers. I was elected. So for the next 4 or 5 years, I'm just going to get on with it. You know, that's a winner takes all system. Whereas actually our democracy, and I think this is beyond proportional representation, so it goes back to the last question, has to be more reciprocal than that. Now, am I in favour of citizens' assemblies where citizens make all the decisions? No, absolutely not. I don't think citizens want to make all the decisions. I think representative democracy works, but I certainly think there's issues where I think, yeah, I want to know a bit more from the public. I want experts to talk to the public, and I want to hear their opinions too. Now, without sounding self-righteous, I do that because I do a lot of door knocking. So I feel like that's my version of a citizens' assembly. But I think it's much better to formalize that and have a space where people can talk publicly. Any politician from any party can hear those conversations. And then those citizens' assemblies can make recommendations. So I think there's places around the world where this has been demonstrated to work really, really well. But I do think there's something in this country which I think is inextricably linked to the first past the post system, which centralizes power. And of course, we live in one of the most centralized power systems in the whole Western world, actually, where there's a whole problem with devolution and lack of power to local authorities and indeed other countries within the United Kingdom. That's a whole nother conversation. But I think, again, that's symptomatic of the first past the post system, that politicians at the top just want to hold on to power, because actually if they shared it, they'd probably start to hear things like, oh, we'd quite like a proportional representative system.
Right. Okay. Next question, James.
We have a question from Nicole, who asks, will a hung parliament be the best outcome hoped for to open the road for legislation PR? I guess that's a question about whether these kinds of impasses are when reform happens.
Right.
Well, I would say yes. And if you look at history of the UK, that's when you've seen these things occur. So, you know, in the wartime period, when the government's composition was somewhat unstable, that's when you saw the Speakers' Conference on Electoral Reform that pitched the idea that the UK should adopt PR. And for a time, it looked in that period like the UK was going to adopt PR. And then throughout the teens and 20s, the issue went back and forth until finally the Labour Party came out against the issue. Again, in the 70s, what opened the door to devolution was Labour losing its majority. And so then opening a discussion. They weren't prepared to go whole hog for PR, but they were prepared to talk about devolution. And they agreed to a referendum process that many people thought was problematic. But they never would have talked about it without that opening. Then we get to the most recent hung parliament where, you know, gee, surprise, surprise, that's where you get a referendum on the voting system, not the one that Liberal Democrats had campaigned on, which was PR, but the alternative vote. So I think there's lots of precedent to suggest that governments that win legislative majorities are not willing, not prepared to open the door to the discussion. It's very, very unusual. New Zealand's experience is quite instructive here, where, you know, majority government after majority government out of office said, yes, we are going to do this, and then got into office and said no. And so, yeah, I think a hung parliament is the best opening that you can have. A related question in the chat is, well, does a majority government have the power to just introduce a new voting system? Yes, they do. In the British parliamentary system, we've got plenty of examples of British or other Commonwealth countries simply introducing new voting systems through a legislative majority in their parliaments. In Canada, we have 10 provincial voting system reforms simply introduced by their provincial legislatures in a majority vote. So, you know, and they're obviously derived from the same constitutional system as Great Britain. Obviously, recently, there have been some changes, and you've seen the courts in the UK start to intervene and tell the legislature that they can't do certain things. Before that, it tended to be parliamentary supremacy. But I still think that the conditions are that if you had a majority government that wanted to do it, they could just do it. Or if you had a hung parliament where a collaboration amongst parties were prepared to say, this is what we want to do, there's nothing standing in the way of that government introducing a new voting system.
Right. Do you want to add anything, Zach, to that?
Yeah, I'd say that's my second best scenario. I'm contractually obliged to say a Green government would be my favorite scenario. But being really serious about it, I think that yes, I think a hung parliament is really interesting, and this is somewhere where I differ slightly from the democracy sector. But I think there should be a citizens' assembly to link the two questions. Right now, over what system should we be looking at. And Make Votes Matter have done some really interesting work around the good systems agreement. So getting all the parties to sign what are the principles of what a fair democratic system looks like. Now, every opposition party, other than the Labour Party, have now signed up to that. I think that, for me, is a democratic mandate to now get groups of people together and start having experts like Dennis present, these are the different electoral systems. Let's have a conversation now about which one represents you. And then there's a democratic sector going, right, that's the one we're going to go for. So then if we do have a majority government, we know, or a minority government, sorry, in hung parliament, we know what the ask is, rather than having that conversation in the heat of an election. But I understand that sometimes the democracy sector aren't keen on that, because who's going to pay for it? How are you going to organise that? Who kind of runs that? And I accept those are all questions I do not have answers to, but I think that's really a conversation that's worth having. And then finally, just to add to what Dennis said, we've also seen in this country recently, the voting system has changed. So for the London mayoral elections, in fact, mayoral elections around the country, and for police and crime commissioners, the Conservatives have changed from a supplementary voting system to a first past the post system, and hardly anyone blinked. So there is definitely very recent precedent that you can change a voting system. And I think if you've won an election, you've then created the mandate to do that.
Can I just jump in on that before I ask James to get the next question ready? So that therefore it doesn't have to be in a manifesto, and it doesn't have to be, I mean, Dennis is a great person on referendum, but we won't give him his referendum time now. That in fact, it could be a government, in power, majority or minority, who could actually bring it in. We all know the Daily Mail and the Sun will go ballistic over that and say, "Oh, you're changing the voting system, without running out in your manifesto." But I mean, here's Sam Rice, get used to that. I just want to slightly disagree with Zach. One of the problems is that the PR movement, it's a pretty still an abstract question of whether we're going to have PR. And I have a great fear of the pro-PR movement breaking into camps. We're the STV camp, we're the this camp, that camp. And that's, we have these debates and get PR done all the time. But I'm very worried about a premature breaking into camps of types of PR until it's still pretty bloody abstract question. Anyways, just jumping in. James, go for it.
Can I just respond very quickly?
Oh, okay.
So one, I share that worry too. So I don't think you are disagreeing with me. I think I was really pleased when you started the meeting by saying, let's not break out into too nuanced conversation about which voting system, because I think, one, it's really interesting, and two, yeah, it's divisive. But I do think that those divides exist between the parties. There's slightly different systems that the parties want. And I think rather than the political parties deciding that, I think citizens should decide that. So I'm not kind of advocating for a big discussion among the democracy sector of every movement, to go, this is the one we're gunning for and campaigning for. But I am advocating for a conversation among citizens with experts to get around something that then there is a kind of democratic mandate to call for. But the second thing I'd say is I do think it should be in a manifesto. I think we want to do politics differently. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be in a manifesto. We will adopt this system of proportional representation. But I think to have a democratic mandate for it, then any party should at least say they want electoral reform, or they think the system isn't working and they want change. How specific you get is up to the individual political party. But just because the Tories have done things without having them in their manifesto, I don't think that's a great route for democracy. So can it be done? Sure. But I think it would be much better for all of us that parties are honest about their intentions at election time.
Okay, Janice, did you want to jump in for a second or not?
Just very briefly, I do think the Citizens Assembly approach to making the decision about which system is a way of getting around this problem, because activists often do have quite entrenched views about which system is the perfect PR system. When I started on this, and look, you are to blame, right? Because I mean, I lived in the United Kingdom in 1987 and 88 for a year, and that's where I discovered this topic. And I was introduced to the glories of the single transferable vote, and schooled on Enid Lakeman's views on why it was the superior system. And but the longer I've worked on this topic, and the more that I've learned about all the adjacent issues, the more I've come to believe that really it doesn't matter which PR system we use. Because the key thing that PR does, two key things that PR does, and this is why our struggle is so important, is one, it represents people more accurately. It allows people to vote for what they want. And it allows them, for the most part, to get what they want, unless they're voting for the monster raving loony party. But, you know, all the other parties, if you're voting for a major party, you're going to get some representative. And that is the first most fabulous, fantastic step towards democracy. But the other thing is that PR breaks the back of phony majority governments, which are at the root of so much bad policymaking, lobbyist influence, public exclusion. That's what it comes back to. And so, given the trends, most people don't give any one party a majority of the vote. We can expect, in our current system, we can expect that in a PR system that will probably remain the same or even go further towards parties not getting a majority of the vote. It means that every government will be an actual majority. And that is, those two things, any PR system will give you those two things. And those two things will go towards the other issues that you've raised in your questions. How will we make the policy process better reflect what people actually want? How will we cut out, you know, those with superior financial resources and return power to anybody, you know, who deserves to have some influence just on the basis of being a citizen?
Thank you, Dennis. James, next question, please. Oh, you're muted.
We have a question here that relates to the cost of living crisis. Will PR be any better at reducing child poverty? Asks Marisha.
You know, these are always tough questions because they then turn into kind of, well, will PR benefit, you know, one side of the political spectrum over another? You know, as Democrats, I sort of say, you know, it's up to the people. It's up to the people what they want. And so I'm prepared to live with what people vote for if we have a transparent and accurate voting system. But I can tell you this, looking at 100 years of, you know, Western European experience, it's very interesting, you know, where PR systems are robust and strong, welfare systems are also robust and strong. You know, we have seen very interesting coalitions between right and left on things like support for seniors. Or support for natal care. You know, we have people who are involved with evangelical communities who end up working with activists who want to support families. And so PR offers a more sophisticated opportunity for these kinds of cross-party and inter-party coalitions to have influence. So do most people want to see an end to people living on the street, homelessness? Do most people want to see an end to child poverty? I mean, the polls suggest overwhelming majorities in every country in the Western world want that. So it seems to me that PR systems will allow those kinds of policy things to move forward, or at least have greater saliency than we're seeing, not as so easily ignored or shunted to the side as they are in first past the post systems. Again, PR systems are not perfect. They're not all utopias. But it is interesting that when we compare comparative welfare states, for instance, in comparative politics, we talk about the liberal welfare states, you know, the United States, Canada, the UK. These are the weakest welfare states, you know, with the least support for workers and people at risk. The countries that have the best social supports are the countries with the most proportional voting systems, the Scandinavian countries, the Benelux countries, you know, Germany, you know, these countries do a much better job. And part of it, I have to believe, is that more people are included. The executive that relies on legislative support must have a broader base in a PR system than it does in first past the post. And that's the secret. That's the magic in the mix. That's why first past the post systems can be more cruel, because they don't need as many people. They can have a minimum winning coalition that can allow them to gain power and have all that power to ram through things that most of the electorate doesn't actually want.
Right. Okay. Next question.
Okay, can I briefly answer, Alan?
Sure, Zach.
Sorry.
Sure, Zach. Go ahead.
Sure.
Quick.
I'll be very brief.
About 6 minutes left here. We'd like us to try and end right at 8:30. So go for it.
Perfect. This is my second favorite subject, proportional representation being my favorite. So of course, Dennis is completely right. It depends on who gets elected. But what I would say is without PR, what we're having is homogeny of ideas in the media. So child poverty or poverty is a good example. We see a media that are obsessed with the idea of GDP, gross domestic product. Even the person who created the idea of GDP says that's a terrible way to measure the well-being of a country. And so when we talk about growth, when we talk about just the growth of the economy, that's awful for the climate crisis. Like, you could say that a growth of, let's say, plastic water bottles is great for a business, but actually that's terrible for the environment. You could say having water fountains on every street corner so someone could fill up their disposable water bottle is bad for capitalism, but it's great for the well-being of us and for the NHS and for the climate. So I think we need to talk about growth of well-being, growth of mental health, collapse of the gender pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap, the disability pay gap. And those narratives are just not heard in the regular mainstream media, because we have two parties with the Labour and Conservatives that have often accepted the same frame and the same kind of narrative. And they can only do that because of a first past the post system. And Dennis gave some other brilliant examples that finally add carbon emissions. On average in the West, if you have a proportional system, you reduce your carbon emissions on average by 18%. Again, that's not because PR is magic, but it just means that where there is a proportional system, you have less vested interests, people are held more accountable, and actually those conversations of compromise and consensus generally result in a policy that is better for people and planet, and that can only be a good thing for everyone.
Thanks, Zach. We're just coming up here, James.
Matt has a question. Should we all get down to the Labour Party conference on the 8th of October to protest?
Let me just, this is, yeah, I mean, GetPRDone is big believer in, as it said in our tabloid, we'll only get PR by campaigning for PR. And Matt and GetPRDone is organizing a picket line at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool on Sunday, the 8th of October, to in fact raise the issue of PR. We're hoping to get lots of people there. If you're interested in it, I even happen to have here the email address to write, which is gprd.zoom@gmail.com. So gprd.zoom@gmail.com. So that was a little plug. I don't know if any other groups want to do any plugs on PR, but we're just a couple minutes left. Any more questions, James?
We have a question from Jesse, who asks, any suggestions for the adoption of PR in the US?
Oh, well, that's a much more difficult question, because one of the factors that influences the adoption of PR is an increase in the party system. And so wherever you see an increase in the party system, then suddenly the major parties have a slightly more interest in the topic, because they can no longer count on the pendulum swinging in their direction. And so in Canada, we've seen a significant increase in the discussion of voting systems ever since the party system broke down into a wildly multi-party system in the 1990s. And it isn't going away, because the multi-party system isn't going away. So the message I tell people is, don't buy the strategic voting stuff. A multi-party system is the best way to keep this issue on the agenda, because it introduces a host of risks for these big parties. And it's a risk for these big parties because, remember, the big parties are funded by very powerful forces. And in Canada, the Liberals and Conservatives have the same corporate donors that give to both of them. And getting a majority government is how they deliver the goods. They need all that power so that they can turn around and funnel state resources back to those actors. But in a PR system, they can't do that the same way, because they won't have all the power. Now they have to share the power, and they won't be able to necessarily get others to sign on to whatever funny business they want to do. So the barrier in the United States are the barriers that are put in the way of multi-party democracy. The Democrats and Republicans basically conspire to block entry to the political system by third parties. And that's really the biggest barrier in the United States. They've made some progress with the alternative vote, the majority voting system, but PR is almost a dead letter, because the first issue is getting around the way Democrats and Republicans make it so hard for a third party to get on the ballot. People can't choose anything else, because there's only ever Republicans and Democrats on the ballot.
Okay, after that depressing note, I don't know if there's any Americans on the call. Some of them maybe are going to come. I really feel sorry for our electoral reformer and colleagues in the United States. If it's difficult here in the United States, it's even 10 times worse. But look, I'd like to bring the session to a close. It's now 8:30. I think it's been terrific, really good. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Dennis, and we'll just sort of wrap it up now. And as I say, we had a really good discussion. I'm sure that we agree that campaigning, I mean, how do we get proportional representation, on the agenda? It's by pushing, by campaigning. GetPRDone, goes out to demonstrations. We were at many demonstrations. William was in London. We went up to Durham. Make Votes Matters on the street with Stull. We've got to make a sense of campaign, that this is not just something sort of, oh, someday we might change it. We got to really make this an urgent kind of thing, because Keir Starmer may say, this is not a priority. Well, a lot of people who are not in the upper ranks of the Labour Party or the Tory Party do think it is a priority. That is, in fact, a lot of, I sort of call the third force outside, the top ranks of Labour and the Tory Party. There's many people who feel really cut off. Because in the Labour Party, you see, so many, the membership actually wants it. I mean, it's an incredible kind of contradiction. And on the issue of democracy, that the Labour leadership isn't even following the views of their own members. So let's call it then. It's exactly 8:30. Thank you very much. Really a great job by people. Thank you.